Welcome back to the December Soap Challenge Club, which was all about going back to basics. So there were a number of things we needed to do for this challenge, and I wanted to discuss them kind of in this little PowerPoint presentation before I actually got into making the soap. So the first part we had to do was work on minimizing air bubbles. Now, before we get into how I did that, let's look at the challenge requirements. So you can see that we had an inspiration photo and we had to use these 6 colors and only these 6 colors. I had to use at least 4, which was great because I really didn't want to use the orange and the orange, red, and the yellow. Not my colors. So the first part of this challenge was about clean lines. You wanted to have very distinct clean lines between each color and element, which right away ruled out doing a gradient, which I would have loved to do with the black, blues, and white. Next, you wanted smoothness. So no air bubbles, gaps, holes, drag marks from your wire cutter, that type thing. Then you were looking at color consistency. So basically you wanted colors to be the same throughout the bar. You didn't want varying tones of black because you didn't mix your color in, or specks because colors didn't get mixed in very well. And you wanted to avoid things like soda ash, which affect the end color and appearance as well. The secondary part of this challenge was the actual color matching. So what we were looking at was all of the above. How well did I do that? And then we were looking at how well I matched colors. So how do you reduce air bubbles? There's a number of ways that you can help minimize them. You're never going to get rid of air bubbles completely. It's just not possible, and trust me, it's not worth the time and effort. People don't notice them. You notice them, but most people don't notice them. So anyways, some tips and tricks. First, pour your oils and let them sit for a while. This is going to let the bubbles that are just naturally created when you're pouring the oils in rise to the top and disappear. You can also spritz the top of your oil with rubbing alcohol, and it will help remove any air bubbles that might still be sitting on top. Next, pour your lye solution into the oils over a spoon or spatula. So again, if you dump the lye water right into the oils, you're going to create more bubbles. And we just spent a lot of time trying to reduce them. So if you pour over a spoon or spatula, you're basically going to help the lye water kind of slide into the mixture rather than break through into the mixture, which will reduce the bubbles. Burp your stick blender. If you stick your stick blender in your mixture, make sure it's completely covered, and then just kind of tap it on the bottom of the pot without letting it come above, where you don't want the holes in the stick blender to break through the top. You'll see that it's going to burp out the air that was caught under the stick blender when you stuck it into your oils. Keep your blender submerged. So once you've done this and got rid of the air, you don't want to pull the stick blender up and then put it back down and get more air stuck in the stick blender. Finally, just like we poured the lye water solution in over a spoon, you want to do the same when you're pouring the batter into the mold. Pouring it over a spoon or spatula will help reduce the amount of air bubbles that are going to get into the soap. So the second part of this challenge was kind of color uniformity, which had a couple elements to it. So the first one was about getting the colors themselves to be uniform. The second was about not having any imperfections on or in those colors. So how do you get color uniformity? You can pre-mix your colors in an oil or water to avoid specks and little bits of unmixed colorant. Now, I didn't actually do this in my challenge. I've been making soap long enough that I wasn't worried about what I was doing, and the colorants I was using I knew would mix well. But this is one way to definitely help avoid unwanted specks in the soap. If you are working with titanium dioxide, this is especially true. I always mix my titanium dioxide in either oil or water. Depends on what I'm doing, what I'm working on, but one of the two. Pre-mix it. Otherwise, you are going to get little specks of white in your soap, no matter how well you stick blend or hand mix. Pre-mix your titanium dioxide. Trust me, you'll be happy for it. Next, gel your soap. When you gel your soap, it helps colors, one, be more vibrant and pop. Two, gelling will help reduce soda ash. So since that was one of our goals, gelling is definitely something that I recommend. If you are using titanium dioxide, a little heads up, gelling can cause glycerin rivers. If your soap gets too hot, it's a likely result. And since we wanted to avoid glycerin rivers, you either needed to be careful on how much you gelled your soap or use something other than titanium dioxide to get that kind of cream white color. Avoiding soda ash. How do we do this? So first, spritz the top of your soap with 99% isopropyl alcohol, or if you don't have 99, you can use, I think there's like a 90 and I don't know what, there's a 70. Definitely try and get 90 or above if you can. It will help. After you spritz the top, liberally spritz the top, completely cover it. Then put a cover on your soap, whether it's a piece of board or something. Just cover it so that the soap can't react with the air. What happens is the lye is actually reacting with the carbon monoxide in the air or dioxide, sorry, and that's what creates kind of that foamy, like little white ash that you get on the top of your soap. So when we spritz it with alcohol, you are, one, putting a coating on it so that the lye can't actually react with the atmosphere, and two, when you cover it, we're further preventing the atmosphere from kind of reacting with it, which will help with soap. Gelling also helps reduce lye, as we mentioned in the previous slide. And finally, if you reduce your water, a high water content is going to be much more susceptible to soda ash. It's also going to make a softer soap, which will make it harder to unmold. You will have to wait longer to unmold it. It's also going to increase the likelihood of glycerin rivers if you're using titanium dioxide when you have a higher water content. So that's kind of all the stuff you need to know about the challenge, things we were trying to avoid, and how I did that. So now let's look at my design. The idea was back to basics. So I had some crazy stuff in my brain, and then I realized that let's keep it simple and clean. You want to showcase straight lines, smooth color, lack of air bubbles. And so I came up with the idea of using multiple layers and then breaking up each of the kind of black-blue layers with a cream in between. So I created some tools to help me do that. You can see in this image, I just worked out the math with the size of my mold, the percentage I wanted each layers, then my batch size to work out how much soap I needed for each layer. These are the tools that I created. So there are 4 scrapers, as you can see, which created each layer. You'll see more of me using these scrapers in the video as I make soap, but this was how I got these nice straight lines. Okay, let's make soap. So those are the scrapers. You can see the braided pieces that I did put on one batch. I didn't put on another batch because I felt like they affected the clean lines of the soap. I used this blue, that teal you just saw, the kind of off-white that you saw in the other jar is actually a light gold from Brambleberry, which I used in place of white. And then for the first batch I used activated charcoal. For the second batch I actually used the black mica. So I poured the first batch, and it was still very runny and loose, I guess, here. So I started scraping it out, and as I went, I realized I needed to let it set up for a bit. So I let it set up, and then once it set up a bit, you can see it's now scraping really nicely. Like, I got a nice clean line, and I was really happy with the result of the scrapers. This was the first time I'd ever made these and used them. Then, as you can see, I'm pouring the cream white layer, and it looks very yellow. It's because it is very yellow. I had 2 batches of soap I was making this day and 2 different fragrances, and I did not realize it until I added the fragrance into the white cream portion that I had grabbed the wrong fragrance. So the fragrance I made in this batch was supposed to be for the other batch I was going to make, and it morphed the colors. I didn't notice it in the black, but yeah, so this is why there are 2 batches and there are going to be 2 cuts, because I was so upset with the colors because the fragrance it changed them just enough that I was like, I need to make another batch. It was really frustrating to realize what I had done, but I'm glad that I made another batch. You can see how I've been scraping out a lot of excess soap. Well, I made this recipe, this loaf holds 5 pounds, but I made the recipe 6 pounds so that I would have extra soap. I wanted to pour, I knew I'd done the math, I knew how much I needed, but I was afraid that maybe I messed up or screwed up, so I just poured a little extra for each layer than I calculated that I needed. So yeah, all that extra I'm scraping out and just putting in a little mold, and that'll go for sample soaps. But the nice thing is that because I messed up the first batch and I made a second batch, the second batch I actually made with 5 pounds. I didn't do an extra pound in the recipe, and I used my exact measurements, and it worked. I actually had calculated it right, and it worked. So I guess we'll look at the silver lining to me using the wrong fragrance. This soap is gorgeous. I really do like the clean lines. Funny little fact, I think I did better avoiding air bubbles in this first batch when I wasn't actually truly trying than I did in the second batch. So the colors are better in the second batch, but the air bubbles, or lack thereof, are better in this batch. Go figure. So this is the last layer that I'm pouring, and you can see that I just take one of the scrapers and I flip it over and basically just use the top end to smooth out and get a clean, straight top. Now, I could have planed this off when I cut it. I just wasn't sure if I really was going to do that or wanted to do that. I hate planing soap. You lose perfectly good soap. So again, I just wasn't sure what I was going to do. So I was like, well, I'm going to scrape it all off and clean it so that no matter what I decide, I will have a nice flat top. And of course, then I decided to add 3 out of the 4 ribbons or braids I had made, and then I only added them to 3/4 of the batch so that I would have some bars that didn't have it on there. That way, whatever I decided when I cut it, I could choose with the braid or without the braid. Of course, I ended up not choosing either because I made a whole new batch. You can see these colors are definitely, the fragrance lightened the black. I mean, it looks gray. The teal is really light. The blue is not bad. And then the creamy white looks yellow. It's just, the colors were off. They were too off to make me happy with the soap. You can see there are little imperfections. You can see where there are air bubbles. You can also see how the braid does cut into the top, and I think affects that clean line look. So the soap was not perfect, but it was a good learning experience, and I think overall it's a nice solid soap, and I like it. And here is the second cut. So I made this soap the exact same way I made the first soap, only this time I used the correct fragrance that doesn't discolor. So you see when I was cutting that, how I pushed down halfway, had to pause, then had to lean on top of it to push the other way. Well, I should say the rest of the way down. Big mistake. There is you can't really see it here. You'll see it in some of the bars, but it left a wire line, and I ended up having to plane these soaps to get rid of it. You can see it partially there when I bent that into the light. I was really annoyed at myself for doing that because I know better. But yeah, anyways, you can see there are definitely air bubbles. When I planed it, the air bubbles came out. They showed a little bit more. It was fun taking pictures. I had 16 bars to work with, and I must have swapped out, I don't know, 7 or 8 bars, playing around, trying to find the one that looked the best. Overall, they weren't perfect, but I think they are lovely bars that go back to the basics: clean, simple, straight lines, good color matching, and I was really happy with these.